5 minutes after the previous one.
Our audience will never know that. But
No, it's the whole...
Time is a relative thing, it's a social construct.
We're in Zoom purgatory.
Yeah.
So, of course, time is a relative thing.
That's right.
It moves faster here.
There's no before, there's no after. There's how much there for much. That's right. There's no before, there's no after. That's right. How much there for much.
Throughout the last year, we've seen a whole bunch of articles, projects, and research about how much urban noise was reduced due to the COVID-19 lockdowns. Hello, and welcome to our second episode in our series looking at the impacts of COVID-19 lockdowns worldwide on sound in the city. Today, we're speaking for a second time with Pamela Jordan, a researcher at the University of Amsterdam, about her project looking in a very interesting way at how the soundscape of the Berlin Wall Memorial changed during lockdown as it shifted from this tourist space to a public space. Welcome to The Rest is Just Noise. My name is Andrew Mitchell. I'm an acoustician and a soundscape researcher at UCL, and I'm joined by my colleagues.
Hi, I'm Tin, soundscape researcher at UCL, and Francesco is again somewhere.
It's still late.
There is no after before, there's no after.
The rest is just noise. Now we're all sorted. So, Pamela, thank you very much for joining us again.
Well, it's my distinct pleasure to join you again. I'm looking forward to our second conversation.
For today's episode, we're going to take this as one of our COVID-19 lockdown episodes, where we're talking with sound and soundscape researchers from around the world about their research and their experiences on how the various lockdown restrictions around the world for COVID-19 impacted soundscapes of, usually I would say soundscapes of cities, but I think you're going to talk to us about some different ways. Francesco, do you want to lead us off into some of that?
I mean, in general, in the intro of the Change Over Time issue you recently published with for the Sounding Heritage collection, you wrote about how COVID had this kind of, pressure and led to some kind of societal shift concerning how we relate with our sonic environments. And I was mostly interested also in the Berlin Wall case. And what do you think it happened there? And if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Sure, thanks. The fundamental connection, I would say, between all of these projects and writings and thought processes before, during, after COVID, is the importance of context.
Question mark.
Again, it's a purgatory of COVID, so there's just now.
I'm so sorry, audience. We're still there.
It's okay.
We're still very much there. But though some may be in denial, we are still there. So this might have been something that I carried through from my study and practice in heritage conservation and interpretation, is the importance and the complexity of context, what that means, how you work with that, how you understand that in a historical timeline, let's say. And it seems fundamental in my work when it comes to historic soundscapes too. And that certainly seemed to be, that was the element I think I was pointing to, Francesco, in the introduction to that issue. Not only because each of the authors is really talking about a different kind of context, but for me, when I was looking at what happened through those initial lockdowns to prevent COVID-19 from spreading, and the angst and the almost, the disturbance that the silence created for people had everything to do with context, because not 3 months before that happened, the calls for a more quiet future and the quieting of cities was quite strong, especially leading up to the year of sound, right, 2020. So suddenly we had what we were asking for, and nobody liked it. Well,
Yep.
Some of us liked it, but not for those reasons.
Yep.
For different reasons.
It's hard to kind of divide them apart like that, but
Yeah. We'll try.
So for me, in terms of let's say the societal shifts, I can't say that I've seen a societal shift. I'm looking out the window right now, and I am seeing no shift. Right? Things have shifted back. The perception that happened in that moment of silence and sounds that were made in that silence is no longer present. It doesn't seem to have had a lasting effect in my experience of the city I live in, which is Amsterdam. All of the practices of, let's say, banging on pots and pans in celebration of and thanks for the health workers that were trying to help everybody in these intense times, and playing instruments out their windows to communicate to the neighbors that they could no longer see, gone, right? We don't need it anymore. And in some respect, that is understandable, of course, that we develop practices to address the time that we're in. But the sensitivity that I was seeing at that time to silence, broadly speaking, and by that time I kind of mean the 2020 mostly, a little bit into 2021. Into maybe summer 2021. That sensitivity was perhaps even willfully forgotten, in a sense, for various reasons. There were certainly a lot of reasons in the US that that silence got charged, and that silence got filled with a lot of noise and a lot of sound. It was really important. And it was an interesting moment that could happen. But then when it comes to the specific research that you were gesturing towards, the Berlin Wall research, well, that was a follow-up from earlier research I had done. So I was in the kind of lucky position that I had done a pretty extensive soundscape study of the Berlin Wall Memorial along Bönaustrasse in kind of center Berlin, which is this long landscape. It's about 1.2 kilometers, really, but I was studying the core of it, which includes this reconstruction of the entire wall apparatus. So it includes the Western Wall, it includes the piece of the Death Strip, the Eastern Wall, the Guard Tower, and a lot of interpretation stations around it, and this landscape that looks sort of park-like, where people can come and really interact with the wall as it was, without ever thinking that it is a replica of what it was. It's very much a fragment and very much a ruin in some places and a reconstruction in others, but it's very clear what the role is and what is being communicated through that ruin, right? And I was always fascinated by this since the first time I had visited it, because I found there still to be a sonic remnant of the sonic environment on the west versus the east, and they were very different in this one space of the Berlin Wall Memorial. I could still hear it, where the east was incredibly silent. I was aware of my movements within my position near the wall because of the gravel that they had used. There were all of these small isolating mechanisms that were in place, both because of the wall itself, the way it had been designed and built, the way that you were being monitored through it, and also the design elements that had been implemented through the memorial. And on the west, it was just cacophony. It was tour buses and trams and people and bikes and ice cream vendors and the entrance to the interpretation of the entire memorial. There's a lot of activity. And so even though it wasn't the same elements in play, let's say the gesture of each soundscape was still
they'd still
apparent.
managed to capture what was there when the wall was actually up. Yeah.
And it wasn't intentional. I had extensive conversations with the director, who was aware of the original design process, and the architects and the people who had been involved, many people involved with that process. And that hadn't really been a conscious element. But again, going back to a conversation that we had earlier about architects having a sensitivity to these things without having language to describe it. The choice of materials within the memorial, just in terms of where gravel is placed, so that you're immediately aware of your footfalls, and where there's grass placed, so that you don't hear yourself moving through the space. Those gestures, yes, are visual, but they also are giving you very specific sonic cues. How the gravel makes people quiet when they go into the the eastern side of the wall. Suddenly they hear it.
Had that gravel been there when the wall was up? Like, did they have a distance separator of gravel to do that? No. So that that's what I mean.
Let me be clear. The wall took many forms, and it had many kind of eastern walls at times.
Sure.
Right. And it was a constantly changing apparatus, because it was right. The let's say the technology was always changing, and the tools that were being used were changing. Very few people from the east would ever get as close to the eastern wall as you can get at the memorial. You just wouldn't go there, because you were being monitored no matter what. Every footfall that you made, every action. There's a cemetery that abuts the eastern wall still in that neighborhood, and anybody entering the cemetery was monitored, and where they were going was tracked. And if somebody threw an orange over from the west on Christmas, that was recorded. And these detailed accountings of these very small sonic moments on east and west were all people on the west could disregard it, but on the east you couldn't. So you would never get that close. So indeed, let's say the gravel sonic environment is not a direct translation. I wouldn't call that if I'm going to be a observationist about it, I wouldn't call that an authentic reconstruction of the original material reality. However, sensorially, it gives you a very specific understanding of your presence in that space that I think is really important. And so for that reason, the sound that was but the sound that was the sonic environment that you could interact with through this memorial seemed incredibly important. Of course, it had to do with how much history somebody knows coming in, how much context they know coming in, to be able to make those distinctions. But even if they didn't, they would still have an understanding that there was a difference on each side. So I had all of that I was really interested in that, and I studied that for a number of years through an Alexander von Humboldt fellowship, and then I worked with a fellowship from the Hedgenuit Stiftung, Hedgenuit Foundation, where I used binaural recording to the soundscape, and I did a soundscape study with volunteers, where I tried to understand what they were hearing and how they were ascribing meaning to it, which we can get into if you like. All of that is background to say that in 2020, I was still in conversation with the director and other people in Berlin, and they said, "Hey, it's really quiet here."
So they noticed, oh, we've got this. Something's changed.
Yeah. Their overall impression was it's quiet. It's quiet in Berlin. It is really quiet, but there are people at the memorial. And I thought, okay. And in talking to them, they saw a shift. Of course, the memorial has a pedagogical agenda. It's trying to bring people in and kind of communicate the broad history of the Berlin Wall from all perspectives to people who come and visit. The people who were visiting were no longer international. They were local.
Okay.
They were from Berlin because you couldn't travel at that time. Really, even between different parts of Germany. And the activities that they were doing apparently were a little different than you would see tourists engaging in generally. Tourists are, of course, taking in the site. They're visiting the site, for its history. They're more or less appreciative of that. And the people who were visiting during lockdowns, while generally respectful, were engaging very little. And in fact, were with the history. They were engaging very little with the history, and they were inhabiting the site in a way that was different
Mhm.
than the people of the memorial were used to seeing. Not in a way that was necessarily bad, but it was just, this is strange. And one of the limitations to my initial study of that space had been that I couldn't talk to people from the neighborhood who were using the space because they didn't.
Because it was just a tourist space, they stayed
Mhm.
away from the crowds of tourists. I think,
That seems to be the case.
yeah, I think most
Seems
people
to
who live in
be-
a touristy city have some, like, know some aspect of that. Yeah, no, I don't go to Trafalgar Square just to go there.
Why not? Why not?
Yeah.
Well, that I was going to say that actually. I
Fourth
did during
point.
lockdown.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Like I
Ah.
would go to, I'd go to Trafalgar Square. I'd go to the whatever the horse yards or whatever it is
Mhm.
there on the mall, because it's a monumental space, right? As we would speak about it, it's a monumental space. Whether or not it's a memorial, it's this thing of London that you just don't go to because there's too many tourists.
So
and it's-
you're doing the sonic appropriation thing again. Again and again. Like, I'm gonna take this.
Well,
sonic space.
it wasn't so much that it was because we weren't, going back to the sonic appropriation conversation with Etta, we weren't doing it to exert any sort of sonic control over our spaces. It was just, the city's empty. I'm going to cycle through it. Where do I go? I go to the architecturally nice places, which also happen to be big tourist places, particularly in London. And yeah, so I'd cycle around and go to those places. Or I'd go to Hyde Park, where I wouldn't normally go, because
Tourists.
either because tourists are there or tourists are in between here and there. So I wouldn't do that. But yeah, I noticed people doing the exact same thing here in London. Just, I guess, I don't know, less specific places, which I know nothing about Berlin. I've never actually been there. But here in London, there's so many of those sorts of places that it wasn't any specific spot that you could notice this change. It was just all over the city. It was easier to get to these places that we wouldn't normally go because they're just filled with tourists.
So was it a sense of curiosity that led you there as well?
It was that, but also just like, you just want to get out of the house because it was lockdown. And all right, if you're going to go and cycle around the newly empty city, you're going to end up in these places and you're going to stop and be like, oh, I've never stopped and actually really looked at this place before. And so it's just a nice new sort of experience. I don't know that I would want it to always be like that, because I appreciate the aspects of London that are touristy and that people come and see. But yeah, it was just a nice different experience. But I don't know if that's a one-to-one thing, because the Berlin, from what you're saying, the Berlin Wall Memorial is specifically a memorial and museum type of thing, as opposed to the places in London, which are kind of just primarily architectural
There are
marvels, I guess,
and public spaces.
and public spaces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what happened at the Berlin Wall, if I may be so bold, is that there seems to have been, so the context shifted into becoming a public space.
Mhm.
It was a public space that was outward facing towards tourists, broadly speaking. Certainly had a significant agenda for German tourists, people coming from other places within Germany, as well as Berlin. But during lockdown, it was open for business. This landscape, you don't close it down. And many people within the neighborhood don't really have private green space that's their own.
Yep.
Exactly.
So, and the parks were crowded. And so they went there instead
Yeah, it's
of the same activities.
That's definitely the other difference with London. We have a bunch of parks. So it wasn't that people were looking for parks. I'd be curious to know, because the closest thing that I personally know that comes to this is actually like the, in Washington, D.C., the Vietnam Memorial, which is this big wall with names of
veterans.
veterans
soldiers.
and soldiers from Vietnam. But it also has a lovely park right next to it. I'd be kind of interested to know whether a similar thing happened there that locals started going to there during lockdowns just to have access to a green space.
But it's a very interesting and intriguing observation you made about finally becoming a public space.
Yeah.
Especially since there were several things happening during 2020 saying the year without public space. I think there was one seminar from Delft or something like that took that perspective, but actually it was a very intriguing shift in users of public spaces at some touristy locations, I guess.
Yeah, Pamela, this makes me think about a question I wanted to ask, because soundscape studies in general rely on the concept of local experts, right? So in the context of historic settings like the Berlin Wall, and especially during the lockdown, so what would the definition of a local expert cover? So who are we talking about? Is that the tourists or the residents? So how do we define that? How do we define the stakeholder
Who's it meant
groups?
for?
Yeah.
In this kind of settings,
That's a very
what's your
important
experience?
one.
In terms of the Berlin Wall Memorial, it ended up being, I think, fairly straightforward because it has such a specific purpose behind its design and how they run it. So for me, there ended up being 3 groups that I could easily define as the major stakeholders. You had the people who visited, what I would say are tourists, but generally people who are coming to learn about the history, who you probably haven't visited very much, if ever. You have the people who work at the memorial and are invested in the foundation that is supporting it, and they're either physically working with a memorial or they are supporting it in some very specific way. And then you have the people who live around it. And in my initial study, what I tried to do was find people who had lived around it when the wall was active. We could call living witnesses in heritage parlance. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to really get too many to participate, partially because I was doing this in English, so of course not. But during the lockdown observations, just in talking to the director and another staff member, I started to think, well, I need to look and understand what these people who are very much local and very much live next to the memorial are thinking and how they are interacting with it. And so the stakeholder of the local perspective, of the people who understand it intimately, for whom it is their background. That had to diversify a bit. I think there is a distinction to be made, especially in this particular memorial's context, between people who lived with it when it was an active military site and people who live with it as a fragmentary background that is a draw for others, right? And a colleague who worked with me on the follow-up research, Dr. Andre Fiebig, he was in Berlin, and he went to the memorial to talk to some of these people informally. We were highly restricted, of course, by what we could do during this time. So it's not like we could conduct interviews and have people do surveys, and we were trying to remain incredibly safe for all people involved. But he went and talked to some of the people that he saw over 2 weekends at the memorial and asked them, "What are you doing here? What is the in a nice way, of course. He's a very good researcher. He knows what to do." So, he was trying to get just kind of their impressions, like why are you here as opposed to the park that I can see that's right over there. What is it about this space, and what do you do here, and do you live nearby? Yes, everybody lived nearby. There were people conducting birthday parties, there were people playing squash, there were people having athletic practice sessions out there, people just hanging out. None of them had lived in the neighborhood when the wall was up. So the context of what the memorial or what the Berlin Wall was in that neighborhood has shifted for that reason, right? And so the way that people interact with it necessarily has shifted. Now, that isn't necessarily true of the people who work at the memorial.
Yeah.
Many of them are either have direct experience or, of course, are highly knowledgeable about the militarized past and all of the history of that particular location along Bernaustrasse. And so their perception of what they're seeing when they start to see this kind of what might be considered irreverent use of a memorial space that is remembering the people who died trying to get across the wall in different places, who dug tunnels, who tried to hide in cars, who tried to swim across canals, they look at people playing squash against the wall and they think, really?
Mm-hmm.
Disrespectful. This is not okay. Right? But then if you talk to the people who are there and using the space, they say this was, if they have, so some of them would come and they would say, what's wrong? We're inhabiting the space. Nobody else is here.
A public space,
this
right?
is ours.
Yeah.
It is a public space. It is open. It is green, the vast majority of it. What is wrong with us having a picnic here? We have a bottle of wine. What is the problem? And some people, in fact, the director gave me a few interesting anecdotes. He spoke to one gentleman in particular, and he challenged him. He said, "Look, this is a memorial to people who were harmed and killed during division. Why are you having a party here?" Right? And the man says, "This was a space that we were not allowed in. It was a space that was kept silent. Why should I keep that silence now?" Right?
Sonic appropriation.
Exactly. Yeah. It certainly feels like the people that were trying to make it across were trying to make it to a space where they could do things like that. So it does feel a bit where you kind of like,
the space came to themselves.
yeah, let me do what they were trying to get to.
And there's historic precedent for that.
Yeah.
As soon as the wall was broken, as it were, in the first few years afterwards, school kids, like school troops, would go into the death strip and just like have class trips and take pictures and look at the space that we weren't allowed in. Let's check it out. This is a bit why I was asking about whether you were curious to see these spaces that you had felt a little bit distanced from before, because I think we all do have this curiosity to see the places that we are familiar with but don't go in.
Mm-hmm.
In altered circumstances. One of my favorite things about living in Washington, D.C. when I lived there was elections. Not elections, inaugurations.
Mm-hmm.
Inaugurations are fascinating because they shut down the city.
Last one was, I mean.
Yeah, well.
Okay, sorry.
Again.
Sorry, make it. I'm sorry.
Uh-huh. Yeah. But because the whole city just completely, all of the systems change.
Yep.
I found it really just an amazing way to understand the city in a completely different way. I'm hearing and I'm seeing things in a new way, right? And I do think that impetus is always there. I don't think that's COVID specific. I think that's something that perhaps we don't think about very often. But unless there's a circumstance that's different in a city or in an environment. And so when COVID hit, I certainly felt that. I wanted to go into spaces where I hadn't been before and hear them.
I think the London case, at least from my experience, was a very different impetus for why it was now open. It wasn't about a memorial space or anything like that. It was cars, right? In normal times, cars own the road because of the way that we've built our cities, particularly in the U.S. I grew up in the U.S., drove everywhere. I lived in Los Angeles, which is entirely owned by cars. And then here, when you had lockdown and suddenly there weren't cars on the roads anymore, it was very much more like, oh, I can just cycle leisurely down the middle of the road and I can just walk through this and start to experience what the city is like when you just are in it instead of like, there's a drawing that goes around every so often of a city where they the streets are just a chasm, right? And they have like planks built across it with people walking along the planks, right? Just showing what we've surrendered to cars. And it was so interesting just to be in that space and be like, oh, that's what it can be like. And I think a lot of people had that, particularly in America, had that sort of realization that, oh, we don't have to surrender the streets to cars. And being in a space where a space meaning in the street where you're not normally allowed, that was quite a new and kind of exciting thing. Yeah. So I think it is quite different because it wasn't about a reverence to a memorial or something. It was just, you can literally physically be in this place where you couldn't be before.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that was also, it seemed to be playing on people's minds at the memorial even.
Yeah.
Because they weren't coming there to be in a memorial. They weren't coming there to remember the dead, right? They were going there because it was an open green space and it hadn't been available to them before. They couldn't do it. And in fact, one of I think the most interesting pieces to come out of that review of the earlier research within this new context was all of the impressions that people gave my colleague, Dr. Fiebig, and also the staff people who talked to me, Dr. Axel Klausmeier and Julia Reichenbach. All of them said, it's quieter. It's really quiet. But when Andre went and measured dB levels, it was off by 1 dB. It really wasn't. It was not. It was completely perception based. It had everything to do with the behaviors and the patterns that people were seeing. That was what was different. And of course the different contributions to the sonic environment generally. But the traffic actually hadn't gone down that much in the period when Andre was measuring.
I think that's kind of a part of an underlying message of our whole series on these COVID soundscapes and our own research that we've published on soundscapes. You started out by saying we suddenly had this period where cities were quiet after decades of calling for that. And then people realized they didn't like it. Yeah, that's the answer. The solution, we shouldn't be trying to make cities quiet necessarily. Quieter, maybe, yeah, because there certainly are parts of them that are just too loud, regardless of what the type of sound is. But that's not actually what people want. They want better soundscapes, which, to go back to sonic appropriation, is soundscapes that they are creating and they have control over. But then also is just full of it's full of sound, but it's full of nice sound. It's full of sound that actually has some sort of pleasant meaning, as opposed to filling the space with traffic sound, right? There's a very big difference there. I think when these cities get quiet, people do fill them with sound. That's what banging on pots was. That's what playing off of balconies was. They fill that empty space with sound. It's just, what are we filling it with? Are we filling it with cars, or are we filling it with people and animals and nature and that sort of thing? Or some combination of the two. That's an option. It doesn't have to be entirely devoid of car sounds. It's just some combination of things where it's not dominated by this droning sound.
Mm-hmm.
Or
it made me also think along those same lines. As much as I was aware of there being fewer cars, which I celebrated every day, it also made me quite aware of the design choices that were being made within the city where I was living in terms of the architecture, and how that is such a fundamental contribution to the soundscape and how it interacts with the sounds that we put in it. Led to a different level of interaction or lack of interaction, which I found challenging as an architect.
On that note, and on just our broader note of COVID and soundscapes, I think we're gonna end this one. Thank you so much for joining us. So as we usually try to end these, if people are interested in your work, if they want to hear more from you or just see what you're up to, is there anywhere that they should go?
Probably the best way to find me right now is through the University of Amsterdam's website. My page on there has a list of some of the projects that I'm working on, some of the papers that I've, the research that I've referenced while we've been talking. But it also has my email address, and people should feel free to contact me. That way I don't have much of a presence on social media, so that's the best way.
Cool. And can you give us any sort of hint on the things that you're working on now or in the near future? Just what we should expect to see?
What can I say? What am I allowed to say? As if it's so secret. I'm not with the CIA or anything.
Well, that's what you would say if you were with the CIA.
It's up to you to figure this out. I'm research in ancient contexts, perhaps intersecting with weather systems and deep earthquake vibrations. A water cistern that has its acoustics have been renovated, let's say. And probably the research that we did as a group coming from the workshop that I recently held that was based in a local fort.
Cool. All right. Well, then, thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for the great conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing how your series progresses. It's been really good so far.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Cut. Yay! We made it.
The rest is just noise.
You can find episodes of The Rest is Just Noise on all of your usual podcast apps.
And on our website at justnoisepod.com. We're also on Twitter as @justnoisepod.
The Rest is Just Noise is supported by the UK Acoustics Network.